Hello, everybody. How are you doing today? How are we doing? That was a strange way to pose that question. Hello. This was not planned. I apologize for the last minute-ness. Just want to finish this book up and get that on YouTube. Hope everybody's been having a good week. It's Tuesday so far. I'm happy to have the day off, doing a lot of productive things today. And I figured one of those things could be finishing this book up, which would be great. So you'll just let me know about audio levels and all that good stuff. I can make things quieter if I need to, or whatever the case may be. Just yell at me if something's too loud or too soft or whatever, what have you. Excuse me, just ate, so. Ugh. Hi, Moocher. Good to see ya. Hope you're doing well. Without much further ado, this is a very comfy sweatshirt. My friend Nick got it for me 4 or 5 years ago, and I really like it. It's super comfy. So, yes. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for being here. Without further ado, I'm just going to jump right in. We are going to finish the book today. We're going to read chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. Chapter 11. A Familiar Prowler. She slowly surfaced back to consciousness and felt the touch of cool hands on her face. Nancy? A vaguely familiar voice was calling her name. Nancy opened her eyes and found herself looking up into Emily's face. The woman looked pale and scared half to death. I'm okay, Emily. Really? Nancy started to sit up. The movement made her stomach lurch, but she fought back the wave of nausea. Holding Emily's arms, she slowly managed to get to her feet. She wasn't quite sure where she was. Some sort of shed. What in the world happened? Emily asked, guiding Nancy over to an upturned barrel. Nancy sat down and massaged her temple. She'd fallen somehow and hit her head. Careful to move slowly, Nancy looked around. Gradually, the room came into focus. Broken glass littered a windowsill. Coils of old rope, oars, and life jackets hung on the walls. I'm in the boathouse, she realized. Suddenly, everything rushed back to her. She'd been looking at old boathouse plans when someone had grabbed her from behind. She could still feel the calloused hand on her wrist. Whoever it was knocked her down or knocked her out. She stood up slowly. For a moment, the walls of the boathouse seemed to spin. You don't look so good, Emily warned. I'm okay, I just remembered what happened, Nancy said in a sober tone. Emily, I was looking at the boathouse plans when someone came up behind me and knocked me out. Boathouse plans? Emily asked. Nancy pointed to the sawhorses in the old plank door that served as a work surface. The plans were gone. He must have made off with them. Emily's eyes widened. I don't believe this, she gasped in horror. Why in the world would someone steal those? She exhaled forcefully and marched over to the boathouse door. When she turned to face Nancy, she looked like she was about to cry. That means I have to have them redrawn. My budget's so tight, but I've already contracted the work. Why would someone want those plans? Nancy asked. Beats me, Emily said, except maybe to cause me trouble. Everyone and his uncle round here knows I spend too much for this place and is waiting for me to default on the mortgage. But that doesn't mean people want to cause you that much grief, Nancy said. You wouldn't think so, would you? Emily plunked herself down on the barrel and buried her face in her hands for a moment. But there seems to be an army of people who resent my being here. I just try to ignore them and pretend they don't exist, she said slowly. First of all, there's that guy from the Native American Museum, Jim. He's been causing grief for everyone on the North Shore. He seems to think present landowners owe his ancestors something for having bought the land. He hassles everyone and is always creeping around the woods, even if he's trespassing on other people's land. I keep finding these weird piles of stones all over the place. The other day there was one on my lawn. Dale told me they give him the creeps and mumbled something about spirit totems. The guy's weird and he's mad at everyone who lives here. I think I know what you're talking about, Nancy said. Had Jim been building some kind of spirit cairn when she and Ned ran into him in the woods? Then there's Steve Delmonico, Emily said. He's furious I bought this place out from under him, even though he was taking forever to decide to buy. He'd love to see me fail here, believe me. He's ready to jump in and buy the place from the bank. I heard about that, Nancy told her. And have you had any trouble with George and Bess's neighbors? The Lawrence Joneses are upset about all the commotion on the lake this summer. They keep talking about boats paddling around at night disturbing the geese and some sort of drilling noise. Emily snapped to attention. Drilling? Her voice sounded strained. Yeah, I haven't heard it myself, but the past 2 nights... Nancy shook her head. So much has gone on, I might not have noticed. I'm not sure what they're talking about. Maybe something over at the camp. I guess I sleep too soundly to hear, Emily said. Then she looked at Nancy. You're looking better. Hey, how come you were here in the boathouse anyway? Nancy laughed. I came looking for you. I spent the morning at the Lost Valley Historical Society and wanted to tell you what I found out about the boathouse and the old Malone property. I thought you might be able to fill in some of the blanks. She reached for her backpack. And because of these, she produced the bundle of letters. The burglar hadn't been interested in Nancy's backpack or wallet, just in the plans. Nancy decided she'd think about that later. She handed the letters to Emily. Look what I found in the cottage. Turns out there's this secret crawl space that was never in the cottage plans. It has 2 hidden entrances. Emily stared at the bundle. When she looked back up at Nancy, her face was flushed. I don't understand. What do these have to do with me? Nancy frowned. Emily's reaction wasn't quite what she expected. They're from Mike Malone to his fiancée, Nellie. I thought you'd be interested in them for your work? Emily gave an embarrassed laugh. Oh, of course. She paused and asked, You've read them? You bet I have. They're partly love letters, but what should interest you more is how they detail the inside workings of the mob at that time. I bet if you ask Jennifer and Jason, they'll let you copy them to use in your film. That's a great idea, Emily said. Anyway, I think whoever stole the boathouse plans was after these 2, Nancy explained. What makes you say that? Well, although everything else in the old trunks and suitcases we found was in very good order, the blouses were still packed away with old tissue paper between them, these letters had been disturbed. The bow was untied and a group of letters is missing. How could you possibly tell that letters were missing? Emily asked. Nancy explained about how she arranged them and discovered a 2-week break in correspondence. But maybe they've been missing a long time, Nancy. You said these were love letters. Maybe if you got too personal, maybe Nellie destroyed them. I hadn't thought of that, Nancy admitted. Emily had a point, but that didn't explain why someone was rooting around the crawl space in the middle of the night, or why he or she made sure to trap Nancy inside. Then she remembered what else she wanted to ask Emily. Last night, you said you didn't know much about Mike Malone, but I was wondering, did he ever marry this Nellie person? Absolutely. Her answer was so sure and definite, Nancy was taken aback. I thought you didn't know much about him. Emily bit her lip and laughed. I didn't. Ravi really embarrassed me last night, so I hit the internet today and I did some research. I guess that fact stood out. Goons like Malone usually had a string of hanger-on girlfriends, their malls. But Malone seemed to have found the woman of his dreams. They got married just before he was busted. Nancy was glad to hear that. His letters to Nellie were surprisingly tender. Reading them, it had been hard to remember that he was a cold-blooded killer. Excuse me, ladies? One of the workmen poked his head in the door. He stared at Nancy for a moment and then at Emily. I'm leaving for the day. Were you able to find some suitable stones to patch up that corner of the boathouse? Emily asked. Yep, that we did. Like you said, there were plenty that were just the right size in the old stone wall at the back of your property. We'll haul them out early tomorrow morning if that's okay with you. Sounds great, Emily said. See you later, Kevin. Sure thing, he said, turning to go. At the door, he turned. By the way, was that Indian guy hassling you again? He was skulking around the boathouse earlier. You mean Jim? Nancy asked, curious. Kevin gave Emily a knowing look. Emily knows who I mean. The guy who's asking for trouble and who's gonna get it. It's the end of chapter 11. Hi, Timo. Thank you so much for that host. I appreciate that. I hope you're having a good day today. Pardon me. Almost choked. Hey, Garrett. How's it going? Thanks for being here. So, before I jump into the next chapter, I wanted to summarize some of the differences that I'm definitely seeing between the book and the other book, and the actual game of Ghost Dogs of Moonlight. So, it looks like Red Knot was taken from the ghost story, the short ghost story that I read first. So that whole thing, and the dogs, like the 4 dogs, that was definitely taken from the short story that I read first. But then Emily is from this, and I guess Jeff Akers is the Jim guy in this one. So it's like they took elements from both books and they kind of mixed them to make Ghost Dogs of Moonlight. And then like the like whole house by the lake thing seems to be a little bit more from this book than from the other. But it's definitely interesting so far. I have a wonder if the culprit is going to be different than in the game, without giving spoilers. Just because some things seem not to add up in the book to like make it so that it makes sense that the culprit from the game is the same culprit. But I'm trying to think. I think in all of the Nancy Drew books that the games are based on that I've read so far, the culprit has been the same as the culprit in the game. I can't remember any discrepancies, but again, I might not be remembering. Okay, anyway. Hi Garrett, hope you're having a good day. Thank you for being here. Alright, I'm gonna jump in to chapter 12. Chapter 12, Shadows in the Moonlight. Jim? Instantly, Nancy tried to remember Jim's hands. Were they calloused? She hadn't noticed that before. I didn't see him, Emily said, but maybe Nancy did. Maybe it was someone else who's the same height as Jim. Kevin shook his head. Nope, it was that crazy activist. Believe me, I'd recognize him from 10 miles away. Ah, well, maybe not quite. Tugging at the bill of his cap, Kevin went to the door. Just thought you should know, Emily. Kevin had barely walked out the door when Emily slapped her forehead. Sorry, but all this commotion got me scrambled. I have to pay the guys. She started to leave and then turned to Nancy. You okay now? If you wait, I'll walk you home. I'm fine. Nothing an aspirin won't cure. But maybe you should warn Kevin about the missing plans. Doesn't he need them for his work? I didn't think of that, Emily gasped. I'd better go tell him about the plans now before he and Dale split. Nancy left the boathouse with Emily, then headed back toward the cottage. Why would Jim want to burgle the boathouse? Then she remembered him hanging around outside the Historical Society library, listening to her talk about the missing plans. She kicked slowly through the grass and tried to recall those ballpoint pen markings on the old drawings. Were they related to Jim's locator markers back on the post-flood diorama? Nancy couldn't remember enough about the pen marks to even hazard a guess. Maybe the old plans would bolster his argument about the moral obligation of contemporary North Shore landowners to help preserve some of the native lands, though frankly Nancy couldn't imagine how. Nance! The shout rang out from the direction of the lake. Nancy turned. She spotted George and Ned in the Fanes' canoe and saw Bess with Ravi in one of Emily's rowboats. They were paddling toward shore at a furious pace. Had something bad happened? As they drew closer to shore, Nancy could see everyone was smiling. George and Ned reached the Fanes' dock first, while Ravi rowed toward Emily's short pier. As Ned tied up the canoe, George jogged up to Nancy. She wore a loose striped shirt over her swimsuit. You won't believe it, we found the absolute best place in the world for a sunset picnic. Out on that island, Nan, Ned said. There's even a barbecue set up. Apparently it's part of the state park. There are hiking trails and the best view of the lake. Bess and George decided it'd be the perfect dinner spot. Nancy lit up. That sounds like fun. Why don't you change into your bathing suit? Ned suggested as Bess trudged toward them from the direction of Emily's lawn. She waved goodbye to Ravi and shouted over her shoulder, See you later, right? Ravi gave her a thumbs-up sign. Wouldn't miss it. Bess is once again smitten, except she hasn't been able to figure out the story between Ravi and Emily, George whispered. Nancy had to smile. So what do we do about food? Nancy asked as they trooped together up the back steps. We've got tons of stuff. Hot dogs, buns, chips, you name it. We'll pack it up while you change, George promised. Within the hour, they were back in their boats and headed for the island. The only disappointment was Ravi. Emily came alone, rowing over with Bess and bringing her own modest stash of picnic treats. So why couldn't Ravi make it? Nancy asked as she threw some hot dogs on the grill. It's the wildest thing, Emily said. I happened to tell Dale about Ravi's project since Dale's kind of into the Drowned Valley ghost thing himself, she added with a tolerant laugh. Anyway, turns out Dale knows about this elderly woman. She might even be close to 100 years old, who lives in a town about 50 miles from here. She knows a ton about the history of this place. Ravi found her number, and she said she'd be happy to talk to him if he could visit before 9 tomorrow morning. So he's going to drive down there, stay at a motel, and visit her. He felt he couldn't pass that up. While George and the others manned the grill, Nancy took the opportunity to take a walk with Ned. They chose a trail that wound up toward the high point of the small island. It was a low, windswept hill. On top there were remains of many bonfires. Nancy and Ned sat down to enjoy the view. They propped their backs against the large rock and watched the sun swing low over the western horizon. So what happened today in town? Ned asked. We haven't had a chance to catch up. Nancy put her thoughts together and told Ned about the 2 dioramas, the map locator tax, and her visit with Karen and their search of the Historical Society library. What was Emily's reaction when you told her about the plans and the letters? Ned asked. Well, that all got pretty complicated, Nancy said, and she related the story about being attacked in the boathouse. This is getting serious, Ned said firmly. Maybe we should call in the cops. To report that a plan was stolen? Nancy shook her head. Yes, Ned insisted, especially since whatever this burglar is escalating. Last night he locked you in the attic. Today he attacked you. But is it the same person, Ned? I can't figure the connection between the letters and the plans, but I am positive there is one, no matter what Emily says. Maybe the cottage burglar was looking for something else, Ned suggested. That's what I keep thinking. Maybe the plans? But they were right there in Emily's house all along, and for the past few weeks at least they've been in her boathouse to help her work crew. Then suddenly the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place for Nancy. She grabbed Ned's arm. Because until today, no one knew they were there. So who just found out? Nancy took a deep breath. Jim. He overheard me talking with Karen about the boathouse and the missing plans. Ned whistled under his breath, then regarded Nancy carefully. But why, Nan? What's in it for him? I mean, plans for a boathouse. That's what's bothering me. Motive. Jim's got to have a pretty strong one to start breaking the law, particularly when he's spearheading a Native American rights campaign around here. Nancy paused. But one of Emily's workmen saw Jim hanging around the boathouse this afternoon. Ned looked sharply at Nancy. What a creep that guy is. I guess so. Something inside Nancy wasn't convinced, but the facts certainly did point to Jim. Just then George called them to join the picnic. Ned, please don't tell everyone else about this just yet. Not until I'm more sure, Nancy said as they descended the hill hand in hand. Okay, Ned promised reluctantly, but it's gonna be hard not to give Jim a taste of his own medicine if I catch him lurking around here again. After doing justice to the hot dogs, chips, and Emily's salad, the friends built a bonfire on the beach and began making s'mores under the light of a full moon. Just outside the ring of fire, the air had a crisp early autumn feel to it. Nancy pulled on a gray hooded sweatshirt. So I guess Nancy didn't tell you about what we saw up on the hill, Bess, Ned said, gingerly plucking a sticky marshmallow off his stick. No, I thought maybe you guys were watching the sunset. That too, Bess, Nancy said, her eyes sparkling. She had a feeling she knew what Ned was up to. But just after sunset, we saw these strange lights flickering far, far out across the lake, and then there was this cry. It was thin and distant like a wail, and all at once the lights went out, Ned intoned in a spooky voice. Bess shuddered and wrapped her arms around herself. She was snuggled in her oversized pink cotton sweater. She looked out over the lake toward shore and suddenly screamed. Look! Your lights! They're back again! Ned started to laugh, but Nancy jumped up and pulled out her binoculars. Sure enough, Bess was right. There was really only one light, and a low droning sound coming from the shadowy form of a flat-bottomed boat pulling up right into Emily's dock. Nancy's binoculars weren't geared for the dark, but her vision was keen. Moonlight flickered around the dark shadow on the lake, and she thought she saw the outline of 2 figures. The engine cut off, and the boat drifted into deep shadow. For a moment, Nancy wasn't sure her eyes had been playing tricks on her, but a moment later, the boat moved stealthily away from the dock in the direction of the inlet on the other side of Camp Moonlight. Emily? Nancy gasped and pulled the woman to her feet. Emily resisted slightly, but in seconds Nancy was bringing her down to the shoreline. Come here. Someone's broken into your boathouse again. Look, that boat just pulled up to your pier. Someone went into your boathouse and is leaving now. Even as she spoke, the boat drifted into the shadows near the shore. Then suddenly the engine started up again, and the boat disappeared around the strip of land, out of view of the island. Nancy turned toward Emily. Instead of looking at the island, she was staring at Nancy. In the dim light of the bonfire behind them, Nancy couldn't quite read her expression. Emily, didn't you see that? Someone broke into your boathouse again. Whoever attacked me this afternoon came back. I didn't see, but I believe you. Emily's reaction was delayed. She leaned into Nancy. What's happening here? Why is everyone against my being here? What's going on? George said, offering them each some s'mores. Nancy saw a boat out there. At first I thought it was just a figment of Bess's imagination thanks to Ned, Emily said, but then I did see something, or at least hear something. It was probably those crazy bird-watching folks. Bet they saw some rare night-fishing bird and tracked it to your boathouse. You better hope it doesn't nest there or they'll try to stop your renovations, George warned with a smile. Nancy frowned. That's possible. She hadn't mentioned the robbery of the plans yet to her friends, and she hoped Emily wouldn't now. Maybe we'd better tramp down the fire and go back now, Nancy suggested, turning toward Emily. Sure, that's a good idea. Though I bet George is right. A lot of birds nested in over that inlet, and the boat was headed in that direction. After packing up and making sure that their barbecue fire had died down and the bonfire was completely out, they headed straight for shore. Nancy suggested they all go to the cottage first and unpack the food, then she'd help Emily carry the light metal rowboat back to the main house. 20 minutes later, Nancy and Emily propped the rowboat against the side of the boathouse. We can leave it here for the night, Emily suggested. I don't think so, Nancy said, wondering where Emily's head was. You've been burgled at least once today. Someone could just make off with this boat. I doubt anyone's after my boat, Emily said with a shrug. But you got a point. She went to the shed and pulled out a large electric lantern. Hold this, she told Nancy as she easily opened the boathouse door and propped the boat inside. Nancy peered over Emily's shoulder through the open door. Is anything missing? Not that I can tell. Of course, if someone ripped off one of the small tools, I wouldn't notice until the next time I needed it. Emily closed the boathouse door behind her. Aren't you going to lock it? Nancy asked. The lock's been missing since yesterday. I misplaced it and I haven't had a chance to get another, Emily explained. Now, Nancy, don't look at me that way. I'm under a lot of pressure around here these days and I can't remember everything. I'll get one tomorrow, I promise. Should I walk you back to the house? Nancy offered. Emily looked at her as if she'd grown two heads. No way. If it's safe enough for you to walk home alone, it's safe enough for me. If someone was prowling around here, they're long gone. Okay, take care, Nancy said, then headed back past the dock. The moonlight was bright enough to make the going easy. She was almost past the dock when she noticed a pair of wet footprints leading up the sand and onto the dock. They were large and heavy and were definitely made by a man wearing muddy work boots. So I was right, she whispered to herself. Nancy bent down to examine the prints. One set traveled up from the shoreline onto the dock, then into the grass. But it was obvious that whoever had come to shore had gone into the boathouse. She was about to continue around to the side of the boathouse to see if the prints indeed ended at the door when she heard the low hum of a motor and the sound of muffled voices. Nancy ducked behind a bush. She spotted two people in the boat. From her angle, she couldn't tell if they were both male or not. Was it Casper and Millicent or someone else? The people kept talking and pointed over toward Emily's house. Nancy's heart stopped. Emily was in danger. Before she could process that thought, she heard rustling in the brush behind her. She spun around. It was Jim. His hair was wet and he had a hunting knife in one hand aimed directly at her. That's the end of chapter 12. Glad it's going good so far, Garrett. 9 hours is not bad, Timo. If that's a legit follow, thank you for the follow. I don't know what the username is, but thank you for being here, Terror. Thank you for the claps. How are you doing this late morning for you? Slid in a stream in between my chores. Because I was doing pretty good at being productive. Thank you for the host. We have 3 more chapters to go before the end of this book. I always pick the cover that's the same cover that I have, even though there's multiple covers for these books. I always pick the one to match the one that I have. Productivity! Yeah. Okay. Chapter 13. Drowning in Moonlight. Nancy's reaction was immediate. She aimed a high karate kick at Jim's arm. The knife flew out of his hand, but he neatly sidestepped the blow. He's trained in martial arts, Nancy realized, quickly moving out of his reach, but she was not fast enough. Jim reached out. As his hand gripped her wrist, she felt his calloused fingers. "Hey!" he shouted. His cry rang out. Someone cursed loudly in the boat just offshore. The curse distracted Jim, and Nancy wrenched free of his grasp. She spotted the knife gleaming in the damp grass and kicked it into the bushes out of reach. Jim glared at her. "What did you do that for?" "You're kidding, right?" Nancy stared at him in disbelief. "You just tried to attack me." "I wasn't attacking you. I was keeping you from getting into some big trouble here. Weird stuff's been happening around here at night in case you haven't noticed." The words were no sooner out of Jim's mouth than an outboard motor roared to life. The mystery boat took off across the lake. Instinctively, Nancy turned around at the sound. Through a break in the trees, she saw a small, flat-bottomed boat head out into the middle of the lake and vanish in the shadows. When she turned again, Jim was gone. He'd disappeared into the brush. A shiver ran down Nancy's spine. The guy moved as quietly as a cat. She decided to go right to Emily's to warn her about Jim, but before she headed up to the main house, she pulled out her penlight and searched the bushes for Jim's knife. It was gone. He had somehow managed to retrieve it when her back was turned. Great, she thought, he's armed. Hands jammed into the pocket of her sweatshirt, Nancy hurried up the sloping lawn toward Emily's house. A neat rectangle of light from the kitchen window splashed the lawn. The rest of the house was dark. Nancy went around to the back entrance, walked right into the mudroom, and almost tripped on something. She looked down and saw some sort of diving gear. A pair of wet flippers stuck out from underneath a bench. On top of the bench was a milk crate filled with old junk covered in green slime. An egg beater, a rusty hammer, a saw, and some broken pottery. It was the kind of stuff that someone would find in Timothy's Trash and Treasures. The stuff had obviously been dredged up from the lake. Tonight, from the looks of it. What was this stuff doing in Emily's mudroom? Nancy realized just then that voices were coming from the kitchen. Was Ravi back? After a moment's hesitation, she walked into the room. Emily wasn't with Ravi, she was with Dale. He wore a sweatshirt and jeans and had work boots on. His hair was wet. A towel hung over the back of the chair. "What are you doing here?" Emily gasped, her hand flying to her chest in surprise. "I thought you went home." "I started to," Nancy said, then she explained about her encounter with Jim. "Man, he came at you with a knife? The guy's gone too far," Dale grumbled. "Do you want me to go after him?" he asked Emily. "I wouldn't bother," Nancy told the workman. "He's probably long gone. The guy can move through the woods like a cat." Dale nodded. "Tell me about it. We're always running into him, rooting around for something. I keep chasing him off Emily's land, but he waits till we've left and then he comes back." "Anyway, I wanted to warn you about him. I didn't like the idea of you being here alone tonight," Nancy said. Emily looked sheepish. "Actually, that's why I called Dale. After seeing that boat hanging around my dock, I decided that maybe I shouldn't be out here all by myself." Dale nodded. "I told Emily weeks ago that if she ever had trouble here, I'd come over and kind of guard the place. I'm gonna check the grounds now." Nancy regarded Dale skeptically. Between his wet hair and the stash of dredged-up junk lying in plain view in the mudroom, she wasn't sure he was telling the truth, or at least not the whole truth. Still, whatever they were up to was their business. From what George had told her, Nancy knew Emily was close to broke and probably had trouble making ends meet. Maybe they were dredging up junk illegally and selling it to junk and antique dealers. At least Emily wouldn't be alone in the house. "I think that's a great idea, Dale," Nancy said. "I don't know what Jim is up to. Maybe he was the prowler we saw before, or maybe whoever stole those plans is back looking for something else. But it's best for someone to be here, at least until Ravi gets back. Right, Emily said. Ravi, he's due late tomorrow. That was a great idea, George, Nancy said the next morning. While Bess and Ned slept in late, the two girls had set off on a hike through the woods. George suggested exploring the forest between the cottage and the Lawrence Joneses' property. It was early, and the woods were filled with birdsong. The air was cool and fresh. Soon after they set out, Nancy filled George in on the events of the night before. Nan, you're right on about Jim, George said when Nancy finished her story. Let me show you something. When I was hiking around here last week before you guys came, I began finding some really weird things. Like what? Nancy asked as she scrambled up a low rocky hill after George. Like this, George said, pointing to a cairn of smooth gray rocks. They lay at the base of a delicate paper birch tree. The rocks had been carefully chosen, and Nancy noted that they were almost symmetrical and arranged in a kind of low pyramid. She crouched down and looked closely at the cairn. She touched the rocks and shrugged. Jim was building something like this over on Emily's property, Nancy said. It doesn't seem very threatening. George giggled. No, of course not. And at first I thought it was sort of cool. I didn't tell Bess, of course, particularly when all the spooky stuff began happening, but this is really weird, George said, leading Nancy deeper into the forest. Look in there, George said, pointing into a shallow cave at the base of a cliff. Nancy stooped down. The cave was shadowed by trees, so Nancy pulled her penlight out of her pocket. She turned it on and grimaced at the sight before her. A small animal skull was in the center of the little cave. Some charred wood and a bundle of tiny bones tied together with a cord were carefully arranged a few inches from the skull. It's some kind of fetish or spirit object, Nancy guessed. George nodded. Probably, but Jim's trespassing and being so mysterious about it all is making me wonder if he's doing this on purpose to spook people out. But why? Nancy couldn't quite make sense of Jim's motives. While his hostility to everyone on this end of the lake was more than obvious, it wasn't enough to prove that he was responsible for the weird things that were happening. He was fighting a battle in court to try to redesignate part of the North Shore as sacred land because of ancestral burial sites. His fetishes and cairns were on other people's property, but that didn't make them particularly threatening. Something about Jim just doesn't add up, she told George, thinking about the night before. Jim had practically assaulted her, but then he told her he was trying to protect her. From what? From the people in the boat? And what about the people in the boat? Last night as she went to sleep, she had thought maybe it was Dale, but he couldn't have gotten back to Emily's house so quickly from the boat. Jim seemed to think that whoever was paddling around in the dark was dangerous. Had he just been trying to put her off? Was he teamed up with the prowler who Nancy and Emily had spied from the island earlier? Nancy sighed as they backed out of the shallow cave and continued walking through the woods. Heading back down the hill, they meandered along a deer trail that descended toward the lake. Now this tree has to be really old, George commented, patting the huge trunk of a towering oak. Nothing's this big around here except on a couple of the lawns. Nancy stopped to admire the stately tree. It towered high into the forest canopy. Its trunk was thick, and Nancy trailed her hand against the bark as she walked around it. Suddenly her fingers encountered the edge of a wooden slat. "Would you look at this?" she said. The slat was one of several hammered into the side of the massive tree. These formed a kind of ladder leading up to a gray weathered platform which was half concealed with newly cut branches from the tree. Some kind of observation point? George suggested. The Lawrence Joneses' property is near here. Makes sense, Nancy said, carefully starting up the ladder. Moments later, Nancy reached the platform and gasped. Lying in full view was Jim's hunting knife, half out of its leather sheath. That's end of chapter 13. You've got your consistency covered. A rusty hammer, but what about a rusty ruse? I think that's a thing. It is a thing. CJ would be proud. How are we doing, guys? Are we hanging in okay? Thank you guys for being here, and to any lurkers that might be here or people watching after the fact. You are much appreciated. Thank you for the claps. We have 2 more chapters and that's it. Boo, boo. Boo, doo, boo. Boo, doo, doo, doo. I like this song so much. Okay. Chapter 14. A Ghostly Fleet. Nancy stuffed the knife in her knapsack, and she and George headed back to the house. Nancy hadn't made up her mind about what to do with the knife, but she was tempted to call the police. Just as they reached the house, Ravi's red Volkswagen roared into their driveway. He jumped out, leaving the engine running, and hurried over to Nancy. "Where's Emily?" he asked, breathless. "At the house, right?" Nancy said. Ravi shook his head. Just then, Ned came out onto the lawn. His hair was wet and his cheeks were pink from a shower. "Hey guys, what's up?" "Have you seen Emily?" Nancy asked Ned. "Sure, she and Bess went into town. Emily suddenly had some urgent errand, and Bess wanted to check out something at the junk shop." Ravi groaned. "I found out the most incredible thing, and wait until Emily hears." He went over to the car and turned off the engine. "Is it private?" Nancy asked, curious as to why Ravi was so charged. "I'll tell you all about it if you give me a cup of coffee," Ravi said with a weary grin. "I'm working with a severe sleep deficit here." "We'll even give you breakfast," George promised. A few minutes later, they were all on the deck. Nancy and George sipped juice while Ned and Ravi dug into a plate full of bagels. Ravi sipped some of his coffee, then started his tale. "You know how Dale told me there was this woman around here who was close to 100 years old and remembered the place before it had flooded?" "Sure, that's why you took off last night," Nancy commented, propping her feet on the railing. "Turns out she lived much farther away than Dale said. She was in a town about 70 miles from here, quite far from the lake. Anyway, I ended up visiting her. Her name's Betty Sue McGregor. Turns out she had more information than I knew what to do with." "About the flooding of the valley?" Ned asked. Ravi nodded. "Her recollections are interesting. She has scrapbooks about the whole process. I was looking through them when I came across some really wild information. It's about Mike Malone." Nancy lowered her feet and leaned forward into her chair. "Our Mike Malone? The same gangster who owned Emily's house and this cottage?" "The very person," Ravi said. "The clippings in the scrapbook didn't spell any of this out, only that the FBI suspected Malone had something stashed away at the house. But Miss McGregor remembers the gossip of the time. The old grapevine was buzzing about Malone. Talk was that one of Malone's cronies told the FBI that stolen jewels and all sorts of loot was hidden somewhere on the grounds. When questioned by a newspaper reporter back then, the feds denied it. But everyone, according to Miss McGregor, knew differently." "Just like I figured," George grinned proudly. "There really was buried treasure." "More like there still is," Ravi corrected. "It turns out the feds found a cache of arms, ammunition, and bootlegging paraphernalia, but they never located those jewels." Nancy exchanged a quick glance with Ned. "So they might still be on the property somewhere?" "Probably, unless of course they were lost when the lake was flooded," Ravi said. "The feds suspected that Malone's wife knew all about the jewels, but they couldn't prove it, and she never led the agents to them, even inadvertently." Nancy felt her pulse quicken. All the pieces of the puzzle are starting to fit together. Ned gave a low whistle. "Malone's wife," he said. "So he did get married." "Isn't it amazing? I didn't think guys like Malone stayed with a woman very long," Ravi said. "He must have been different from most of them. Emily's gonna flip when she hears all about this. Old Miss McGregor said she'd love for Emily to come and look at all her scrapbooks. She really takes pride in being part of the oral history tradition of the lake." Ravi checked his watch. "The problem is, I won't be around to tell her. I actually have to drive back to New York today, but I'll be back early next week. Pass it all on if you see her. I'll phone her tonight and give her more details and then figure out if we can set up a date to drive back down to see Miss McGregor. Emily has just got to see those scrapbooks. And an interview with Miss McGregor would be really great for her documentary. The shock's gonna blow Emily away." As soon as Ravi left, Nancy turned toward her friends. "Ravi's wrong. Emily's known about this all along." "No way!" George declared. "How could she?" "I'm not sure, but it makes perfect sense. She's researching Prohibition-era gangsters, then spends a ton of money to buy Malone's place. She must have stumbled onto something. I think she's been our prowler all along. I think she's been checking everything out, looking for anything that would lead her to Malone's wife and any sort of secret exchange of information between them." "The letters in the attic," Ned commented. "Right, and the plans. Though how the FBI ever missed those, I have no idea." Nancy tried to recall the plans, then remembered the penciled arrows that had been carefully retraced with ballpoint pen. But the plans were stolen, Nan, George pointed out. If she already had them, why would she steal them? Someone else had to know about that loot. Nancy frowned. You've got a point. Maybe I'm moving too fast here. Maybe she knew something, but not everything. Well, what about Jim? George asked. He's been acting really suspicious. Maybe all those fetishes are some sort of cover-up for his own personal treasure hunt. Or maybe he's trying to scare people away from places where he suspects the loot might be buried. Why would he even have a clue about where Malone would have hidden things? Ned asked. Oral history, Nancy mused aloud. It's pretty strong in the Native American community, too. Miss McGregor might be one of the few survivors from that era, but stories get passed down, and Jim was definitely trying to locate something. Remember those pins I saw in his diorama? He was pretty defensive when I asked him what they were about. So what's next, Nancy? Ned asked. I mean, even if someone finds this stuff, who's got the right to claim it? Emily, if it's on her property? Nancy shrugged. I have no idea, but if we're talking about stolen goods, then I'm sure the police would be more than interested. Right now, what I want to know is how much Emily knows. Nancy got up. But look, guys, let's keep this to ourselves for now. I don't want to let Emily know that we suspect something just yet. What about Bess? George asked. Nancy shook her head. Let's leave her out of this for the moment. The temptation to talk about missing jewels and Malone's wife might be too much for her to handle. That night, Nancy couldn't sleep. She kept trying to figure out the exact connection between Mike Malone's love letters, the missing plans, Jim, and Emily. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something very obvious. Wait! The secret passage, that was it! Nancy instantly got out of bed, threw on her clothes, and tiptoed downstairs. Of course, if Malone had gone so far as to build a secret passageway in the cottage, there was probably another one in the main house where Emily lived. Maybe there was a secret tunnel or crawlspace at the boathouse, too. Before she'd been knocked out, she'd noticed arrows pointing to an outside corner of the boathouse that had been recently excavated and propped up with beams. A map to another secret space? Nancy couldn't wait until morning to check out her hunch. She slipped on her shoes, grabbed her hooded sweatshirt and a flashlight, and headed out into the cool night. The moon was so full and bright that she was able to make her way to the boathouse without even turning on her flashlight. As she rounded the corner of the building, a movement out on the lake caught her eye. Nancy ducked back around the side of the building and looked out onto the lake. Sure enough, a boat was silently making its way out of the bay. Then, as soon as it was a good 1/10 of a mile out, the motor kicked in, and the boat raced for the waters beyond Camp Moonlight. Nancy hurried up to Emily's dock. A canoe she'd never seen before was moored to the pilings, and a damp paddle was resting in the bottom of the boat. Nancy jumped in, loosened the rope that tied the canoe to the pier, and paddled after the other boat as quickly as she could. She had no hope of catching up to it, but she could at least follow it and find out where it was headed. Nancy paddled furiously, keeping her eye on the speeding boat. It skimmed past Camp Moonlight, then vanished around the rocky promontory. Nancy was so intent on following the boat that she almost didn't see an empty rowboat drifting right toward her. Where'd that come from, she wondered, paddling clear of it. As she looked back over her shoulder, an eerie sight greeted her eyes. The shallow harbor of Camp Moonlight was a ghostly flotilla of drifting boats, canoes, rowboats, flat-bottomed dinghies, and kayaks. Nancy froze with her paddle in the air. How did all those boats get loose from their moorings? They had been tied up on the beach the day before when she and Ned had run into Steve Delmonico. Someone must have cut all those boats loose, but why? Just then a dinghy drifted next to her. It banged into the side of her canoe, practically tipping it over. Nancy struggled to keep the boat upright. Suddenly a male figure rose up out of the dinghy and let out a loud cry. He lunged toward Nancy, tipping her canoe. Nancy struggled to stay upright, but didn't have a chance against the man's strength. Nancy was thrust into the cold, dark water. She tried to grab onto the edge of her boat, but a booted foot kicked her hand, sending a jolt of pain up her arm. She let go of the boat and sank into the depths of the lake. That's the end of chapter 14. One more chapter to go. I don't want you to leave out of embarrassment from your own awful cover pun, because it was a great pun. Square dancing time. You're not a square. I'm not sure, but it makes perfect sense. What? Had to kill a wasp. Oh, man. She was missing something very obvious. Wait, Nancy got up and prepared fourth dinner. Oh, I wish. Yeah, the wasp whacker. Hi, Blake. How's it doing today? How's it doing? We have one more chapter today. I'm curious to see if it ends up being at all like the end of the game. Tried a new food. What'd you try? The Wasp-Wookergy. Wisp. Alligator. Oh, I love alligator. So we have alligators here where I live. I live in Charleston, South Carolina. We have a lot of marsh. Like, we have the ocean, but then we also have the marsh. Lots of alligators live in the area. So I've had alligator. I think alligator's delicious. I hope you enjoyed it. Gator is pretty good. Thank you for dance breaking. Okay, are we ready for the last chapter? Okay. Chapter 15. The Past Revealed. Nancy's head stung from where she hit the side of the boat, but she was conscious. With a few strong kicks, she surfaced right under the canoe, coughing and sputtering. She took advantage of the air pocket between the canoe and the water and gulped down a couple of deep breaths of air. She had to right the canoe. Nancy pushed with both hands, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like someone was holding it down over her head. Someone was trying to drown her. Nancy panicked for a second. Then she gulped down another breath of air and dove deeper underwater, swimming away from the boat. With a thrust of her legs, she propelled herself up out of the water, clear of the canoe. But not clear of the man in the dinghy. Before Nancy could orient herself, a paddle crashed down on her head. Everything went dark. The next thing Nancy sensed was something cold, rough, and damp against her bare arms. She tried to open her eyes, but her head was pounding and her eyes felt stuck shut. "Take it easy," a man's voice whispered, "and be quiet." Nancy couldn't tell if his words signaled a warning or a threat. She felt a wave of nausea and began to cough. Rough hands lifted her head up. Nancy touched the ground. It was damp sand. She was on a beach. The memory of what happened on the lake rushed back to her, the flotilla of boats, the male figure that towered out of a dinghy and tried to drown her. But how had she landed here? And where was here? Finally, Nancy was able to open her eyes. They were sticky and they stung. "What happened?" she muttered, looking up. It was Jim. Shock and fear made her scramble to her feet. Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stand and face him. She quickly scanned the unfamiliar beach, looking for something to use to defend herself. "It was you who just tried to drown me." Jim gave an infuriating laugh. "I don't believe you. If I were going to drown you, why would I drag you all the way to the beach?" Nancy stared at him. "Oh, so you just happened to turn up and..." Nancy stopped mid-sentence. Jim's hunting knife was hanging from his belt. How had he retrieved it from the Fane cottage? Jim followed her eyes. "Look, this is a hunting knife. I use it for cutting rope and branches, not people." He lifted both hands open-palmed in a gesture of peace. "How did you get it back?" Nancy asked. Jim's face registered pure confusion. "Back?" He touched his knife. "I never lost it. I found it yesterday morning on a platform in the woods right near one of your rock piles." "Oh, you mean up in the blind? That's not my blind. That's the Lawrence Joneses setup. For so-called nature lovers," Jim said mockingly. "What they're really doing is messing up the environment." Nancy studied Jim. Had she been wrong all along? "So then what exactly are you doing here? It's the middle of the night, Jim." A funny smile played around his lips. "I could ask you the same question, and I have a feeling we'd have a similar answer," he said. "There have been some weird goings-on around the lake at night over the past few months. Dredging at night, digging in the woods. I've been trying to figure out if someone's been out to disturb the sites that some of our Native American archaeologists have turned up. We found some tribal artifacts." "The map locator's on your diorama," Nancy blurted. Suddenly it all started to become clear. Jim's weird behavior began to make sense. "What about all those fetishes and cairns?" "I've been trying to mark places that have sacred meaning to our people. If we win that court battle, we'll have a right to a narrow strip of land that runs through all the property on this side of the lake. I've been trying to blaze a rough trail through some of the more sacred spots. Maybe our tribal elders will want to keep them free of visitors. But I'm hoping they'll want to create some sort of self-guided educational walk so that people in the area will know the true history of the native people who lived here. As Jim spoke, his eyes brightened and his face filled with passion. Nancy had really misjudged him. So after all this scouting around at night, what have you found? And who just tried to do me in? Nancy rubbed her head. And why? Jim put his finger to his lips, motioning for Nancy to lower her voice. I'm not sure why, but obviously your own scouting around seems to be making someone very nervous. I don't know what you've been looking for, but I suspect you're close to finding it. Here, come with me, Jim said, motioning for her to follow him. Nancy took a moment to orient herself. She finally stopped shivering, but she was still cold and felt a little sick. She looked to her left and realized that she was on the other side of the promontory that formed the western border of Camp Moonlight. The shallow beach was semicircular in shape, with the western part of the camp on the left and a lower wooded strip of land on the right. There was no dock or pier. The beach ran right up to the edge of the woods. What is this place? She asked Jim. State Park. It's small, but it gives hikers access to the water. He started up the beach. Nancy followed him. Jim moved quickly but quietly. Together they climbed up to the crest of the wooded hill. Jim dropped to a low crouch and Nancy followed suit. He led her behind a boulder, then motioned for her to look below. Nancy peeked around the rock. There was another moonlit beach hemmed in by trees. Clearly visible in the moonlight, a woman stood knee-deep in the lake. As Nancy watched, a man in scuba gear broke the surface of the lake just a few yards away from the woman. He was holding some sort of box. It was dripping with weeds and muck, but even from where she stood, Nancy heard the woman cheer. "We found it!" she cried happily. "Emily Griffin!" Nancy whispered, slowly shaking her head. So Nancy had guessed right. Emily knew about the treasure all along. Somehow she'd figured out where to find it. And that nasty Dale Warehousen, Jim murmured. Nasty? Nancy repeated. That's the polite word for him, Jim declared hotly. That guy and his partner have been breaking every rule about dredging in the lake for artifacts. The police turn a blind eye to it. Either they don't believe these guys ever turn up anything of value, or they just don't care. It's illegal to take anything from the lake, whether it's tribal or not. Meanwhile, Dale and his partner have also been raiding some of the small Native American sites I mentioned earlier. They look dumb, but these guys are smart enough to sell anything valuable someplace far from here. They bring all the general junk to Timothy's in town. Tim's another one who turns a blind eye, though the stuff they bring him is really only of value to junk collectors. Let's get a closer look, Nancy said, slipping past Jim and quietly moving down the hill. The brush was thick and Nancy was able to creep within a few yards of the pair. They had carried the box to the shore and were both bent over it. What's she doing? Jim asked. Nancy couldn't believe her eyes. She has a key, she whispered excitedly, turning to Jim. Had Emily found the key in one of the trunks? Or maybe that's what was under that floorboard in the pantry? Hey, what's going on there? Jim whispered loudly to Nancy. Nancy whirled around. While Emily knelt in front of the box, trying to work the key in the lock, another man had slipped behind her. He was holding a piece of driftwood in his hands and was brandishing it over her head. It was Kevin, Dale's partner. Where had he come from? Nancy didn't give it a second thought. She sprang into action. Emily, watch out! She yelled, tackling Kevin from behind. Kevin fell flat on his face, but Dale was quick. He grabbed Emily's arm and the box and began dragging them toward the woods. Kevin quickly recovered from Nancy's surprise attack. He rolled over and tried to pin her down, but Jim raced to her rescue. He yanked Kevin off Nancy. You tried to kill her once tonight. You are not going to get that second chance. He hauled him back and punched Kevin in the nose, knocking him out cold. Nancy scrambled to her feet. Dale has Emily, she said breathlessly. What do you think? Is it safe to leave him? She gestured toward Kevin. He's down for the count, Jim said, then followed Nancy into the woods. They could hear Dale and Emily crashing through the bushes just up ahead. Let me go, Emily was shouting. Give me the key and I'll let you go, Dale snarled. Nancy stopped in her tracks. She motioned silently for Jim to go in the opposite direction so the two of them could circle around the pair. Jim nodded, put his fingers to his lips, and let out an owl's cry. Then he raised 3 fingers. Nancy grinned, a signal. A few minutes later, hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo, rang through the forest. Emily and Dale were still shouting at each other. Nancy counted to 3, then burst through the bushes. You again? Dale snapped, but Jim had grabbed him from behind. Yeah, us again, Jim said. He looked toward the spot where Emily had stood only moments ago. Hey, he said, surprised. What happened to Emily? Maybe she doesn't want rescuing, Dale taunted. Nancy could hear Emily stumbling through the forest. Jim, I'll follow her. Why don't you bring Dale down to the beach? As soon as I get Emily, I'll call the police. Jim nodded. Nancy followed Emily's trail. Just ahead, at the clearing on the edge of Camp Moonlight, she saw Emily half running, half limping down the dirt driveway of the camp with the box tucked under her arm. It looked like she was headed for the line of forest between her property and Steve Delmonico's. Emily caught up to her easily. She grabbed Emily's arm and the box went flying. It landed hard on a rock, popping open and spilling its contents. Precious stones of every sort glistened in the moonlight. There were ruby bracelets, diamond pendants, loose stones, all sorts of gold rings, a fortune's worth of gold coins, and finally a small oval locket. Nancy stooped down over the box, but Emily tried to kick her away. Stay away, that's mine, she cried, as Nancy warded off the blows. Emily sank down beside Nancy and began to sob. Just because you found it doesn't make it yours, Emily, Nancy said. You didn't even find it on your land. If you had, this is stolen property. The FBI looked for this stuff all through the 1930s and never found it. Obviously, the place where Malone buried it got flooded by the lake. It looks like he planned it that way, Nancy added. She thought for a moment. Malone did have the foreknowledge of the hydroelectric project. He planned that his treasure would be buried where no one but he or his wife could eventually find it. Nancy wondered about whatever happened to Malone, why he never came back when his jail time was finished. Just then the wail of sirens pierced through the night. Emily looked up, clearly panicked. She tried to gather up the jewels. Nancy stopped her. I wouldn't try to avoid the police on this, Emily, or you might end up in some real trouble here. Suddenly, George, Ned, and Bess broke through the bushes. The beams of their flashlights danced across Steve Delmonico's dirt drive. Nancy, thank goodness you're okay, Ned cried. I heard a noise, and I thought there was a ghost, Bess admitted shyly. I grabbed a poker that I've been keeping in the bedroom and went downstairs. Then I saw you walking toward the boathouse. When I saw you set off in a boat, I woke everyone up. And by the time we got outside, your boat was gone and there were hundreds of canoes everywhere, George pointed out. What's with Emily? Ned asked and then spotted the jewels. Man, that's Malone's treasure. All that jewelry, Bess gasped. It's not Malone's treasure, it belongs to me, Emily suddenly cried, grabbing a locket and jumping up. But the state police were coming up the driveway. Just then Steve Delmonico came barreling out of his house. Caught you, he shouted as the police got out of their car and walked toward the little group gathered by the edge of the driveway. What's going on here? What are you kids up to? Asked one of the officers. Then he spotted the jewels. Oh my gosh, is that what I think it is? His partner shoved back his hat. I don't know what you think it is, but I'd say that's a pretty valuable cache of jewelry. Does it belong to any of you? Me, Emily said, two little red spots burning on her cheeks. She stood square to the policeman. This locket belonged to my great-grandmother, which makes it mine. Your great-grandmother? Nancy asked. Mike Malone's wife, Nellie, Emily said with a defiant toss of her head. Well, I'll be, Steve Delmonico exclaimed, looking at Emily with new respect. That's why you were so hot to buy that property, so you could find those famous missing jewels. Congratulations, you've hit the jackpot. Wait a minute, Nancy said, talking directly to the troopers. She found this box buried just offshore of the state park, not on her land. The troopers turned to Emily. You're wrong, it's mine, Emily insisted. Yes, I found it there, but it is still mine. You kids had nothing to do with all those boats being vandalized, though? One of the troopers asked. Doesn't matter, I won't press charges, Steve said with newfound deference to Emily that Nancy personally found revolting. Then I will, Nancy said. None of us had anything to do with those boats. If you row over to the state park beach, though, you'll find Jim Whitehall Evans. He's standing guard over Dale and Kevin. They assaulted me and Emily, and they're the ones who vandalized Mr. Delmonico's property. The trooper got on his walkie-talkie and radioed the Lake Patrol police to pick up the two men and bring Jim back to town. As soon as the trooper was off the radio, Emily asked, So I can keep the box and its contents? No, miss. First of all, it seems that it is stolen property. Second, I need more proof of your relationship to Malone. If your story's true, you'll have to prove it in court. Meanwhile, I'll have to confiscate this. If you come into the barracks with us, we'll give you a receipt for its contents. Emily looked devastated. Just then, the trooper's radio squawked. Lake Patrol had picked up Jim and the two men. They would book the two guys and get Jim's statement about what happened. I should go into town too. You'll probably need my account of what went on tonight, Nancy volunteered, putting her hand on Emily's arm. Emily started to pull away, and then relaxed. Tears started rolling down her cheeks. I'd appreciate the company, Emily said quietly. Nancy turned toward her friends. Maybe you guys could follow in my car? When Emily's finished down there, we could give her a lift home. Ned, Bess, and George agreed. So now, what's the whole story, Nancy? Bess asked early the next afternoon. I can't bear the suspense 1 minute longer. The night before, after brief questioning, Emily had decided to stay in a motel in town. She would go to court in the morning to stake her claim to the property she'd found. Nancy's friends waited outside while Emily and Nancy spoke to the troopers. Everyone except for Emily had arrived home just as dawn was breaking over the lake. They were all too tired to talk, but Nancy had promised to relate Emily's story over brunch. A light rain was falling, and the foursome was devouring pancakes at the table in the family room. The deck doors were open, and a fresh, damp breeze blew through the room. It turns out, Nancy started, that Malone's wife was visiting relatives with her infant son at the time of Malone's arrest here at the lake. The missing letters from that packet I found revealed the fact that he'd buried a box full of jewels and gold on the far end of what was then still his property. He purposely buried the box in a place where it'd be offshore once the lake was flooded. Wow, his planning worked, George marveled, pouring herself some orange juice. She passed the container to Bess. The FBI was never able to find it. Apparently his wife knew all along where it was. She was supposed to be able to retrieve it if she needed the money, but the FBI kept too close a watch on her, just like Miss McGregor told Ravi. But where does Emily come into all of this, and how come she didn't know about being a Malone until recently? Bess asked. Or did she? Nancy shook her head. When Emily's great-grandmother died on the West Coast, her son was adopted and given a new name by his adoptive parents. Griffin? Ned surmised. Yes, Nancy continued. This woman's son was Emily's grandfather. And by the time Emily Griffin was born, no one had a clue that she was actually a Malone. Until Emily researched her documentary, Bess concluded. It's such a romantic story. It's a sad story, and I don't know if Emily will ever be able to claim the property. There must be insurance questions. The only thing that she seems to be able to prove legally belongs to her is the locket, which has her great-grandmother's photo in it. She found another photo of her during her research. But how did she know about the letters, and what about the plan? George asked. I'm not sure. She said she knew there had been letters of some sort because she read that the FBI began intercepting twice-a-week mail from Malone to his wife when he was in prison. Emily learned about the secret passage from plans she found in the main house. The letters inside mentioned a plan for where the treasure was hidden and the boathouse. She never did find out what the boathouse had to do with anything. Maybe Malone originally intended to hide his stolen goods there. For a moment they all sat silently listening to the drum of rain on the deck. It is a sad story, Bess said. Finding out who your family is and then learning that you have a relative who is a big-time gangster? Nancy nodded. Emily's having a hard time with that, but I think in the long run it's going to work in her favor. Imagine doing a documentary about your own great-grandfather. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Anyone home? A high-pitched woman's voice called in a British accent. Oh no, Bess slumped down in her chair. The Lawrence Joneses, now what are we to do? We can't tell them we aren't here, George said, getting up and going to the door. Hi, come on in, she said brightly. Nancy heard a clear note of insincerity in George's voice. I hope we aren't bothering you, Millicent said, walking into the family room. She eyed the remains of the friends' brunch and grinned. I think maybe the peace offering is coming at an odd time, right, Casper? She had handed George a large covered cake dish. It had a see-through lid and inside was a fluffy pink layer cake. Her husband shuffled in after her, looking distinctly shy. I don't think the timing matters. Actually, we wanted to apologize to you kids. We've been blaming you for all the problems we've been having. It turns out that with one exception, you've had nothing to do with any of it. Those awful men, Dale and Kevin, from that hauling company seem to have been behind most of our problems. Oh, you heard about all of that already? Nancy said, somewhat surprised. It was on the police scanner. We listen to it a lot. It's the only way we know what's going on around here. We hear sirens, we see lights, but we never know if someone's been murdered or what, Millicent complained. George motioned for the couple to sit down. No, thank you, Casper said. We've got a lot of work to do today. There's a whole raft of eider ducks on one of the Audubon folks spotted over in Bailey's Cove. That's clear across the lake. We can't stay. But I do want to apologize for thinking the worst of you kids. Apologies accepted, Nancy said gracefully. Good, because I thought you might like this souvenir of your stay here. He handed Nancy an envelope. She opened it. Inside was a glossy black and white photo. Nancy winced. Oh, I don't believe this, she groaned. It showed Nancy wide-eyed and stumbling, about to fall face down into a pile of thorns. It was the shot she'd triggered when she tripped over the Lawrence Jones's night photo set up a few nights back. Bess, Ned, and George gathered around. Ned and Bess couldn't help but laugh. George gave Nancy a friendly pat on the back. Nancy, I can't believe it. For once you really look like you lost it. She smiled. For a moment, Nancy was mortified, then she began to laugh too. I do make the funniest looking screech owl anyone's ever seen. End of chapter 15 and end of book. Let's catch up. Makes me sound so cool, I can assure you I was not. It was just me armed with a spray bottle of soap. Gee, you're always cool, pretty sure. Can confirm. Okay, if you insist. Did you say upon cornering it for the funnel, time to clean up your act, wasp? Scrit, scrit. But also people if they question my uses. Solved a first world problem watching the stream on the TV. Couldn't chat. Fetched a phone. Now chat works via that. That was a really good rhyme, Dr. Seuss. You couldn't use the iPad as the use to browse. Oh, okay. Man, look at your multitasking. Late night woods Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel, said Jim. Why else would I be out here? That's why you're out here, right, Nancy? Hoping for a sudden twist that Jason pops up out of nowhere and attempts to machete Nancy. Heh. Sorry, Nancy. Nothing personal. Activates trap card. Dramatic anime music plays. Looks like you're going to the Shadow Realm, Nancy. I'm not very familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! If I'm honest. Will Nancy find a way out of Jim's trap? What mysteries lie in Nancy's Millennium Magnifying Glass? Tune in and find out the next exciting episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! That's a quality box! Pancakes, yay! Not everything is romantic, Bess. Thank you for the hearts, Timo. Bess proceeded to eat the entire cake. I will end you, George, said Nancy. The end. That'd be terrible. Casper the Friendly Ghost. Yeah, definitely the same thing. Apparently I fell asleep. The last thing I remember was the start of 13. Thanks for relaxing stream. Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for hanging out with us. So that is the end of the book that Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake is based off of. As you can see, there were definitely some changes. The next book I will be reading on stream is going to be a Series of Unfortunate Events, book number 10, The Slippery Slope. And then let me grab the next Nancy Drew book I'll be reading. One moment. Oof. This one has a sticker across the front, but the next Nancy Drew book I'll be reading is The Haunted Carousel. So, this book is a bit older, and it used to belong to Kimberly, so shouts out to Kimberly. This book was published in '83. And I got it for $1.50. Hi, Twixie. I hope she enjoyed the reading as well. Alright, guys. Well, thanks so much for hanging out with me. Sorry that this was kind of like a... Thank you for shouting out, Kimberly. Thanks for hanging out. I know that it was kind of last minute, not really planned, but I had an hour or so to kill, so I figured I could finish the book. Hype, Kimberly, hype! I hope you guys have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. I will definitely be seeing you guys tomorrow for Best Wednesday, and then I'll see you some other time soon after that, I'm sure. Take care. I'm going to go work on some other stuff, but I appreciate you all being here. I hope you enjoyed, and have a good rest of the day. Much love from me to you. Bye.